Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.
The interview series Reflections in Time was begun by the late Paul Borghi more than 15 years ago. This new series continues Paul's work and is dedicated to his memory. This is how Paul began many of the 73 interviews that he recorded. It's often exciting to look at the future of UNO, what it might be like in times to come. Sometimes, though, it's important to stop and take a look at the past of the university, the people and the happenings that helped make the excitement of future history possible. With this in mind, join me for Reflections in Time. My name is Jack Newton. I'm retired now, but I'm still active as a professor emeritus. I've been on the faculty of UN Omaha since 1960 and served for 20 years as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. I worked closely with Paul Borghi in the development of his original interview series, and I can think of no more fitting tribute to him than to continue this work. We're here on the last day of March in the year 2000 in the studios of KYNE at the University of Nebraska in Omaha, and I have today as my guest Dr. RIT Carl Camp, a longtime professor of political science at UNO, currently retired. But when did you start here, Carl? 1967?
June of 1967.
1967, and you were here till 1999 when you retired just a year ago. And you've been in the political science department.
Yes.
So
an interesting department.
Yeah, and you served in all faculty ranks. You started out as an assistant professor, and you ended up as a full professor. And we're department chairman a couple of times, if I remember correctly. We'll get a chance to talk about that a little more in a few minutes. But to begin with, you know, we've known each other for a long, long time in many capacities, everything from the Cub Scouts to, you know, to your role as department chairman. But I don't think I've ever asked you much about your roots, though, Carl. Could we begin talking a little bit about you? You know, where you came from, what your education was, how you got started in all of this?
Sure. It's an improbable thing, my ending up here in some respects. I'm a native of South Arkansas, a farm boy. And we, on our farm, we grew corn and cotton, sugar cane, peanuts, sweet potatoes, oats, watermelons, cantaloupes. It's a fairly self-sufficient operation. But along about my sophomore year in high school, I thought farming wasn't for me, and so I declared to my parents that I was going away to college and was going to earn a living some other way than farming. And I did. I went to the local college, Southern State College, in the county seat in Magnolia, Arkansas. And I had it in my mind that I would be an accountant, a CPA, that I would eventually enter investment banking and trust accounting. But about halfway through that program, I came under the influence of a very strong social science faculty at Southern State. And I was kind of bullheaded. I had invested 2 years in accounting major, and but I was very interested in political science and economics as well. So I continued with my accounting major and graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration with a major in accounting and in economics. But I loaded up on social science courses, particularly political science and economics. And members of social science faculty kind of took me under their wing and sponsored me for graduate school. I applied all over and got offers from all over, but I took what I thought was the most attractive offer from Washington University in St. Louis, and began graduate.
What year?
That was 1956.
Mm-hmm.
I began graduate work at Washington University in political science in 1956. I was married at the time, and my wife taught school in St. Louis suburban area while I was going to graduate school. I tried to earn a little money while I was doing my graduate work, so I went to school half-time and worked half-time for the 5 years that I was in St. Louis.
Mm-hmm.
And during that time, I researched my master's degree and my doctorate, and received my master's in 1960 in political science, and had worked half-time all those first 4 years.
Was that work related to the accounting background that you had, or?
Well, it was more political science and economics. I participated as a graduate research assistant in a community survey in St. Louis, and the whole object of that survey was to see about the prospects of merging city and county governments. St. Louis had a city government, a county government. It was surrounded, the city itself was surrounded by 97 different
So this was really appropriate then to your graduate work.
Very much so. And I was fortunate in my last year of graduate study at Washington University to receive a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship that permitted me to go full-time, try to finish my dissertation, which I didn't do. But by that time, we had our first son, who was born in 1960, and I felt I should be out earning a living. And so, as an ABD, I went into the job market, which
ABD
was
is all but dissertation,
all but dissertation, yes. And took my first teaching appointment out of the graduate assistant teaching that I did while at Washington University, to join the faculty on a one-year appointment at Sophie Newcomb College in New Orleans, Louisiana. It's a girls' school connected with Tulane University. The idea was that the professor who I was replacing, who was away on a one-year sabbatical, probably would not come back, and thus this would lead into a longer appointment. Well, he decided to come back, and so I had to get a job after 1 year. And I went to the University of Tampa, and at a very low salary, in a tourist-impacted economy, and we barely survived. Our second son was born while we were there, and I saw that I had to get someplace that I could earn a bit more money than.
What year was that? Okay.
That was in 1963, I believe it was, right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we had a front row seat.
Yes, I would guess in Tampa that would be a pretty big deal.
Yes, it was very large. I guess it was 62,
large
63.
Cuban population.
Yes, right. And we lived a mile from MacDill Air Force Base, which is a major strategic air command and other security facilities. So, nevertheless, after a year there, we finally got back in the Midwest at Southeast Missouri State College in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. And while there for 3 years, I finished my dissertation, which I received in 1965. I received my PhD in '65. Stayed another year, and then went to what I thought was a major opportunity at Western Kentucky University, which was the old Western Kentucky State College, old normal school. It had gone through the usual changes into university status, and it looked as though that institution was prepared to take off into a new era for its history. And so I had great hopes there. But by the end of the first semester, the dean of the college and the chairman of my department had gotten at cross purposes. And when I came back from the Christmas break, my chairman had, quote, resigned, and the dean was pushing his protege in the department to become the chairman. I didn't like the politics of the situation, and so paradoxically, as I took up my appointment in the fall of 1966 at Western Kentucky, I got a letter of inquiry from David Scott here at the Municipal University of Omaha.
He was the department chairman.
He was department chairman in political science at the Municipal University, and I had known him in the Missouri Political Science Association, having been chairman of the political science department at Southwest Missouri State College, and he was inquiring if I would be interested in coming for an interview for a possible appointment in comparative politics and Latin American politics and a few other subjects. And I brushed him off at the time. I said, I've just made a move and everything's fine. Well, the funny thing was that all of that dissolved within a few months, and so the first of the year in 1967, I picked up the phone and called him, and I said, is your position still open? He says, yes, it is. And so he said, why don't you come for an interview? And so I did that in April of 1967. And it's rather miraculous that I came to then the Municipal University and eventually UN Omaha, because when I stepped off the plane at Epley, my worst stereotypical views of this region were confirmed. Our view was that Nebraska was much like Siberia, flat and cold. And I stepped off the plane, it was raining, mixed with snow and sleet, and I almost went to the counter and booked my immediate return to Bowling Green, Kentucky, where I had roses blooming in my backyard at that time. But nevertheless, I had the interview, and it went well, and the offer was made, and I accepted. And so I came to the university with the encouragement of David Scott and Bob Harper, who was Dean of Arts and Sciences at that time, that this financially strapped institution that was struggling to survive would be eventually merged into the University of Nebraska.
And it happened the next year?
And it happened the next year. I was gratified because it was a very large leap of faith to come to a campus that was financially strapped. And
well, you mentioned your first impressions of Omaha when you landed at the airport. What was your first impression of the university itself when you saw it?
Well, the people were great, but the campus was not your traditional campus by any stretch of imagination. It was fairly bleak. There were only 5 major buildings. There were a lot of temporary buildings, Quonset huts and so on, metal buildings. But there was Arts and Sciences Hall and the Epley Library building, the Milo Bale Student Center, the engineering building, and the field house, and that was it. And there were large expanses of white rock limestone covered parking lots around with parking meters all over them. And coming from Bowling Green, Kentucky, which is basketball land USA, when I was taken to the field house on my campus tour, I was just appalled. I walked in, and here was a vast field of dust, out in the middle of which was a hardwood basketball court, and that was the basketball venue for...
You had a dirt floor, and
a dirt floor all the way around. I thought, these people have to be kidding.
They took up that wooden floor and used it for something else.
Yes, right.
Had to set it up every time they needed to practice.
Absolutely. Despite those early impressions, I said yes, I would come here, and I've never regretted it.
Well, did you? You mentioned some of the differences between UNO, or what then the University of Omaha, Municipal University of Omaha, and the other institutions you'd been at. Can you? Are there any other impressions you had of differences between the two?
Well, obviously it's an urban campus. It was then, though in dire financial straits, and it was a commuter student population, no residence halls, and all the other campuses I had been on had residence halls. Washington University had just gotten a few, well, it had a few residence halls, mostly fraternity and sorority facilities when I was there in graduate school. But all the other institutions that I had connection with from undergraduate days on through graduate days had residential populations, and so this was very new to me. Also, there was a very large military student contingent. This was the years of the bootstrapper program where professional military people were given detached duty to pursue and complete baccalaureate degrees, and so this was kind of, I think, the lifesaver of the university.
Yeah, I remember we graduated 600 or 700 of those students a year.
A year, yes. At one point, I think the count was maybe 1,100 in residence at one time.
Do you have many of those students in your classes?
I did, because the politics courses were very interesting to them, very important to their preparation. Some of my best students, and I've had a lot of good students over the years, but some of my best students were bootstrappers. I'll tell you about my initiation into the classroom. Dave Scott told me, well, okay, you teach a couple of sections of national government, then you teach your specialty Latin American politics, but we don't have anybody to cover Asian politics, our Asian politics course, and so you're going to have to do that. I nearly fainted because I had at that time never had an Asian politics course in my preparation, and the learning curve was very steep. And those courses were packed full of bootstrappers who had tours of duty in Japan, in Korea, in Vietnam. The Vietnam War was going at that time, in Okinawa, Guam, all over the world. And for me to stand in class and try to teach these very worldly wise and experienced individuals was, well, to say the least, laughable. But they were very tolerant of me, and they helped me a lot. And I'll be eternally grateful to them for their tolerance of my feeble efforts on their behalf.
My recollection is that some of the more traditional students we have saw the bootstrappers as what they used to call curve breakers.
Absolutely. They could do that.
They scored so high that it made the other students look bad.
I had taught for 8 years before coming to UNO, to what became UNO, and I had never had such a high incidence of curve breakers where out of a 100-point exam, at least some of my bootstrappers would get 110 points. I'd give essay questions on my examinations, and they would write treatises under time pressures, unbelievable time pressures. I was just astonished and gratified.
These, of course, were very highly motivated people, because if they didn't graduate, they lost their commissions in the military.
Yes, they did.
That's one source of motivation, I guess.
I'll tell you a little story about. I mentioned the parking meters and the limestone parking lots. You got a good deal of traffic in and out of the parking lots, and there was always. We lived just a few blocks off Elmwood Park, off the campus, and especially with the wind blowing to the east, we would get dust from the parking lots, and a little fine white dust. And we were so relieved whenever the parking meters were taken out and the parking lots were paved over west of the engineering building and west of the field house. Our boys, however, Jeff and Scott, were very disappointed, because they always looked forward to the coming of spring when the snow melted. And they would come up on campus, and they would go around at the base of the parking meters. They would find nickel and dime and quarters. People would drop coins when they fed the meters, and they would fall in the snow, and they couldn't find them, and the boys would come up and find treasure.
I guess there are not too many people around like you and me who remember those parking meters, Carl. They were an interesting institution in themselves.
Really.
Remember one of the student organizations every Christmas time, remember that? They used to put paper bags over the parking meters that were painted or made to look like Santa Claus.
Yes.
And that was their gift to the students and faculty.
Yeah.
They didn't
it was
have
a nice gift. It was very creative.
Yeah. So we didn't have to plug the meters those days.
No.
What was the curriculum like back then when you first came here?
Well, it was fairly standard curriculum, but very limited because there was very little graduate work. It's mostly undergraduate, and the university was just on the cusp of growing into a real university. You know, and I know that somehow the campus had gotten the reputation as West Dodge High, kind of not a real college or university, which I really think was undeserved, but nevertheless, within a short period of time after the merger, the curriculum was fleshed out, it was given greater depth and breadth, and graduate programs began to be created. I was fortunate enough to work with John Farr, who's now Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, in making the proposal in political science for the creation of a graduate program in that department. And colleagues took our proposals and massaged them and fleshed them out, and so the department launched its own graduate program, as did a number of others shortly after the merger.
What were the department's strengths back then?
Not much different from, are you talking about in terms of total personnel or?
Yeah, I guess I was going to, my next question was going to be how big was the faculty and how many people on it, but was there any specialty in the department that tended to get emphasized?
No, the department was a general department. It covered really all the major sub-disciplines of, or sub-fields of political science, but we didn't have any real depth. We had people in public administration at that time, in American government, in political theory, in international politics, in state and local government, in comparative government in Europe, Latin America, in Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, but not in Asia. I was the guy for that. I was so relieved when finally the department got authorization to get an Asian specialist.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the faculty. You mentioned John Farr already, and Dr. Farr, of course, is, if I remember correctly, was a specialist in the Soviet Union.
Yes.
But then he left the department and went on to become to work in the Vice Chancellor's office. How big was the faculty back then?
I think when I came it was a total of 6. And we began to get authorizations for expansion.
Because the university back in '68 grew quite rapidly.
Oh, very rapidly after the merger, because the student population grew. I think it was less than 6,000 when the merger took place, and within a short time it was
something like 28% in a year or so.
Yes, it was just phenomenal. And so the need for faculty, you know, was manifest. It was great. And so the department got its fair share, and it went from I guess it was 7 that we had when I first came in '67, and it grew to 12, including public administration.
Now you mentioned public administration. Let's stop for just a moment and talk about that. If I remember correctly, back in the early '70s, shortly after that, the public administration group in the department was split off and moved to a new college.
Right, that was one of the developments associated with the merger, was the creation of several new colleges, beginning with the College of Public Affairs and Community Service, and still later the College of Fine Arts was created. But the creation of the College of Public Affairs and Community Service took our faculty in public administration and combined with faculty from criminal justice and social work and I'm trying to think who else. But in any case, that depleted the size of the department. We had grown to 12 people, and we dropped with that to 8 people.
So 4 people left to join CPACS, the College of Public
Yes,
Affairs
right.
and Community Service.
And over the years, as the new colleges were created, I kind of, tongue-in-cheek, described the College of Arts and Sciences as being an organ donor for the creation of entirely new entities. Because
well, that's continued to the present day. We just split off computer science not too long ago to the new College of
so true.
Yeah, IS&T, Information Sciences and Technology.
That's right.
What did you maintain contact though with these people? Had been your colleagues since the time you arrived here. Did you maintain a cordial relationship with them, and were they still involved in any of your curriculum?
Well, Dave Scott, the chairman of public administration, continued to teach an occasional course.
And he was the person who hired you, right?
Yes, right. And yes, we did maintain contact. But this was a difficult period because of both generational differences and some pedagogical differences of view. When that split-off occurred, there also were some hard feelings, and we need not get into that now, but there was a tense period and some internal controversy for a time just before the breakaway occurred, and we had to work our way through that, and fortunately the department stayed together and worked its way through those internal disagreements, and thus there's been remarkable stability in the department. I think the problem with the department has been that while it's been a very strong and in many respects a productive department, its enrollment growth was not as spectacular as in some of the other departments in the College of Arts and Sciences, and therefore as new lines were added to the Arts and Sciences budget, we were never really a competitor because other people were growing faster than we were, and so the department still is consists of eight faculty members, which was its size at the time that public administration went over to the new college.
One of the things I meant to ask you about, and it slipped my mind for a moment, when you first came here, we were talking about the differences between your previous experiences and your experience here. I remember quite clearly that because of the nature of the campus, it was a commuter campus and we had many part-time students, we also had a very large evening program. Was that something new for you when you came here?
It was. I as a graduate assistant, I taught in the evening college, University College at Washington University for several semesters, but all my other times, other campuses on which I taught, I was not involved in an evening division, and it was new.
Did you have a number of evening classes assigned to you?
Oh, sure, yes. Every semester, at least one evening class, and sometimes I took on additional work, and what was called an overload, and I would teach a course down at Offutt Air Force Base, where the university was involved.
Well, I remember my first year here, I had 3 evening courses at once, and that was a bit of a surprise. I'd never taught a course where I had all in one night. I mean, 3 hours of it went from 7 to 9:40, if I recall correctly.
Yes.
And we had a 3-hour course that met once a week. So instead of meeting 3 hours, 1 hour each day, 3 times a week, we met 1 hour one evening for 3 hours. And
that was a challenge. Getting used to that, but eventually I got in the swing.
Oh yeah, because I soon lost my voice a few times.
You finally develop a rhythm. I was glad when I became a senior faculty member and didn't have to put up with those very often.
Okay, well, any other reminiscences of that time? You said there were 8 people on the faculty when, after the people left from public administration. Do you remember who was it back then?
Oh, okay. Well, there was W.C.B. Lambert, who was a senior member of the department after Dave Scott left. Orville Menard, who's a European French politics specialist. We acquired Bernie Colassa, who was state politics and interest groups, and a presidency person. We acquired the services of Jim Johnson, who is in the area of methodology and political behavior. And who else do we have? My mind goes blank at this time. There
was a long time ago.
Jung Chung, who finally relieved me of my Asian politics responsibilities. And sure I'm forgetting somebody, but I don't know. We were a close-knit group after we got through our philosophical differences in the
your personal
mid-70s.
interest is in international politics, particularly Latin America and so on. If I remember correctly, you at that time or sometime in the mid-70s were very instrumental in the founding of a conference here in Omaha, the National, was it National Third World?
The Third World, yes, the Third World Conference. Jung Chung, who was our Asian specialist who took my burden off my shoulders upon his joining the faculty, came to me when I was chairman, and he proposed the creation of a conference modeled on the European Studies Conference, which is a collaborative effort between a number of different departments, but principally history and political science. Early in its history, it was chaired very often by Orville Menard in our department. But he thought that there would be demand for a conference that focused attention upon the so-called, at that time, developing world. And so we made a pitch to the administration to get some support from College of Continuing Studies, which was kind of the umbrella college under which these kinds of programs were advanced. And so we got support for that and established in, I guess, 1977, the annual Third World Conference. And Dr. Chung and I co-chaired that for 5 years. Actually, 6 years. There was a 1-year hiatus whenever there was a glitch in the funding, and so 1 year we didn't offer it. But yes, that was, I said it was an outlet for faculty because we've never had really a very generous travel budget throughout the university, and our people needed to get out and interact with other colleagues in similar disciplines and so on in intellectual pursuits. And so if we couldn't travel often to conventions and conferences, then the next best thing would be to bring colleagues here, as was being done in the European Studies Conference and as eventually was done in the annual Third World Conference. So we had a role in getting that established after a rocky start. And so after reviving it, following a 1-year hiatus, I decided it was time to go on to other things. But it was a very rewarding and very demanding experience, and it's still going. I think it's coming up the 23rd or 24th annual Third World Conference.
About that time, we also instituted a major in international studies, didn't we?
That's right.
Did you play a role in that? I can't recall.
Yes, well, there were a number of us who, in various departments, were involved in that. But I like to think that I had a role in the initial design, the interdisciplinary design of the entry-level courses for the first offerings in the international studies major, because I had a very thorough interdisciplinary experience in my graduate training and in my 1-year stint in the Middle America Research Institute at Tulane and Newcomb College in New Orleans. And so I was very much into interdisciplinary approaches to the study of social and political phenomena. And so fortunately I had at least some input into the initial design of the entry-level courses that were put forward in a funding effort with the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare.
We had a fairly substantial grant to start that out,
yes.
And if I recall, those courses dealt, as you say, were interdisciplinary, and they dealt primarily with third world issues.
Yes, yes. I remember the initial theme, which was an interesting hook to try to get the funding. Mm-hmm. We focused on so-called landlocked countries. Bolivia in South America, Malawi in Africa, and
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, yes. Okay. Strangely enough, Afghanistan, where the Afghanistan Center was just beginning, and that seemed to be the hook that attracted the funds for the initial startup. And I'm very gratified. It has grown, and
right.
Yes, well, we had the Afghanistan grant at that time.
Studies, yeah. And then Malawi, because we had a professor who was at that time from Malawi and was very interested in teaching some of the history of his country, and then Bolivia, probably because of your interest in Latin America, and we were looking for a landlocked country,
yes.
Another landlocked
yes.
country.
It was an interesting and exciting time to be part of that startup.
We got all
then
kinds
to
of
see
awards for that.
Indeed, and it was very exciting to see that catch on and to grow into the international studies major.
Well, let's shift gears here for a minute and talk about another aspect of your service at UNO, because it's a very important one, and that is I think you played one of the biggest roles in faculty governance of any individual that I can remember. You were faculty senate president something like 4 times, if that's
four
probably
times.
That's probably
improbably,
a record.
But 4 times.
Probably
yes.
a record, Carl. And at important times too, back in the early 70s, and then again in the 90s. Can you tell us something about that?
Well, I'll give you a little background on that very quickly. I remember in my comprehensive examination, my august professors were grilling me, and one of them posed a question, well, what are you going to do with your graduate degree in political science? And I came forth with an astonishing statement, well, I'm going back to my home state, I'm going to run for political office, I may become governor. And they were aghast. There was a great gasp. I was going to waste my time.
If you became governor of Arkansas, you might have gone on to the presidency.
They made it clear to me that, no, you don't want to do that. Why would you waste your time going into the political arena? And so I trimmed my sails very quickly and managed to get through that interview and pass my comps. And so... well, I never gave up my idea of community service in some capacity, and so the outlet that I found was campus politics and faculty senate and committee work and so on. And so it was kind of the best of both worlds, not causing my former professors to turn over in their graves, and at the same time taking a fairly activist role. And it's been very rewarding, very gratifying, sometimes frustrating, but mostly rewarding and gratifying.
In these 4 years that you served as faculty senate president, maybe we should explain for our listeners who aren't as familiar with the way campuses are organized as you and I are, who've worked here for many years, that the faculty senate is an elected group of the faculty that acts as a legislative body, but primarily as an advisory body to the university administration. Yes. And then the faculty senate president is really the spokesman for the whole faculty, because you're elected. It's a member of the faculty senate who's been elected by the faculty to that group, and then is elected by his or her colleagues to to head up the Senate, to chair the meetings and so on. And so your colleagues evidenced a very substantial confidence in you, I guess, in electing you 4 times to this role.
I don't know whether it's confidence or just weariness. Somebody had to do it.
But in these 4 years, are there any particular things that stand out in your mind as being
oh, Jack,
particularly important?
There are many things. This, of course, was an institution that was undergoing rapid change in status and in funding and in faculty size and student population and curricular content and all of that. Everything seemed possible at that time with following the merger, and there were great hopes and there was great excitement. It was a very exciting time to be on the campus. And well, I know in my first term in the Faculty Senate, not as Faculty Senate President, but as a freshman senator, we had a campus sit-in by members of a black student organization, and you're very aware of the confrontation there and the
this was in
furor
this was in the late 60s, and
right,
there were
69.
There were such things going on at campuses all over the
elsewhere.
country.
The campuses were in turmoil over the Vietnam situation, and so we weren't exempt from that, although the issues were not necessarily Vietnam related. But a group of 30-something black students, members of black liberators on campus, sat in the president's office seeking remediation of some grievances that they had, and the president called in the local police and had them arrested and booked and so on, and there were emergency faculty senate meetings. Well, I was just a freshman senator at the time, and when the Senate was called into emergency session to respond to these disturbances, these unusual situations, I got into the debate. I've always been outspoken, and so I kind of fingered myself, I suppose, for at the end of the meeting, Paul Stageman, well, the Senate authorized the creation of a committee, an investigative committee, and Paul Stageman named me to he was president of the Senate at that time.
Dr. Stageman, a chemistry professor,
yes,
and president of the Senate.
He named me to the committee, but he didn't stop there. Then he named me chairman of the committee, and I'd been on campus, I think, maybe 2 years at that time, or I was in my 3rd year. And everything was tense, and campuses nationwide were going up in flames, and there were all kinds of protests, and we seemed to be in for it. And
you remember who else was on the committee with you?
Oh, I remember a lot of them. Some fellow by the name of Jack Newton.
I was on the Faculty Senate back then,
yes,
too.
Right. Chips Kessler.
Dr. Kessler from the
psychology department. And my gosh, who else? I don't
history
know.
Department.
Bill Petrowski from history, yes. Bill Utley, who was Dean of Continuing Studies. And there were a couple of students.
Business College, Frank Forbes, was he on it?
Who?
Frank?
Maybe he was. Well, I haven't reviewed that in a while, but in any case, it was a tense time, and campuses were going up in flames.
I remember many of the meetings.
Oh, yes. Right, and so in trying to respond to the situation, we conducted, I'm still amazed by the cheekiness of this, it was born of lack of experience, a saturation survey, opinion survey of the student body. What was it that they were concerned about? Why were they so agitated? And so we developed a questionnaire and administered it through the classes, both day and evening classes, to, I don't know, some 10,000, 11,000 students at that time, and got feedback from them as to what their gripes were, what their concerns were about what was happening or not happening on campus. And then we assessed those data and wrote a report and made recommendations to the Faculty Senate, which eventually forwarded the recommendations to
I think that's
an
important milestone in the history of the university. There was another important milestone, another committee very shortly after that, I think, where you did a survey on faculty salaries that had perhaps equally important impact on the history of the university.
Right. There was a great deal of of griping and complaining in the faculty about what were described as inequities in faculty salaries across different divisions or units of the university. And so faculty had a meeting one weekend to respond to this sense of grievance. And I was a member of the Senate at that time. I went to see what was happening and managed to convince the participants that the matter ought to be submitted to the Faculty Senate for study and for review and for recommendation. And fortunately, the members in attendance there were willing to have the Faculty Senate, which was fairly new at that time, take on the task of investigating. The university administration at that time was they played financial matters close to their chest, and it reflected attitudes that went back to difficult financial times when
it was the municipal university that wasn't a public
well, it wasn't a public university in the same sense.
But the budget wasn't as public as the state university budget was.
And so the Faculty Senate commissioned a study of the faculty salary situation, and fortunately or unfortunately, I got appointed chairman of that committee too. And so we did, the faculty group that was appointed to that committee, a one-year study of faculty salaries throughout the university on this campus, and eventually made recommendations that were substantially affirmed, accepted by the Senate, and went on then for negotiation with the university administration on this campus. And the upshot of it was that at least a good many of the recommendations were accepted and acted upon.
And I think that was an important milestone.
Well, a number of colleagues got some relief in their compensation, some fairly substantial relief at that time. It didn't solve all the problems, but it certainly made an inroad into them. I would say, going back to the campus demonstrations and the report on the black students sit-in in the president's office earlier, that as the investigative committee was coming down to the point of reporting to the full Senate, I had received a communication from Wayne Wheeler in the sociology department saying that with all the complex of problems that were evident in the demonstrations and student complaints and so on, that maybe the time had come for the university to consider creating an ombudsman position on campus. I thought that was a good idea. And so at 1:30 in the morning, before the day that we were to take up the final report in committee of the committee's recommendations, I sat down and wrote a piece to include, I hope colleagues would accept, to include in the final report recommending the creation of an ombudsman position on campus. And I took it into the committee the next day, and I think it was your words, Jack, that got that last-minute amendment of the committee's report into the report and before the Faculty Senate, and the acceptance by the faculty of the idea of creating the ombudsman position. And it has been with us ever since, and I think it has been very instrumental in cutting through red tape and a complex of problems, and has now mutated into three persons occupying that position, covering different segments of the university. I've been very gratified with the outcome of that particular.
It was a very effective position, I recall. Well, we have about 10 minutes left. Time has gone very quickly.
Time flies when you're having fun.
One of the things I'd like to be sure to include, though, before we end up this interview, is your activities in the local chapter of the American Association of University Professors. I remember you were president of that at least one year, and that was at a fairly important time when we got the first contract with the AAUP. Could you elucidate on that a little bit?
Yes, I would have to say that my graduate institution brought me up right. Introduced me to AAUP and its role in campus affairs when I was in graduate school, and I continued that focus on the various campuses where I served.
Again,
until I came
if
here.
I interrupt just a second, just for our listeners who are not as aware of this as people that work at the university would be. This is American Association of University Professors, a nationwide organization with a long history that has been very active in the early part of the century even. In fact, the famous Statement of Principles on Tenure was published in 1940, so it gives you some idea of how far back this institution goes. And then in later years, more recent years, has also served a role in the unionization of faculty on a number of campuses across the country.
Well, I've always been tried to be actively involved wherever there are such chapters, and so the effort to get collective bargaining on the campus in response to salaries not keeping up with inflationary pressures of the 1970s and opening of the 1980s had been going on for 3.5 years before I finally became involved in actively involved in AUP in the collective bargaining effort. AUP had been recognized finally by the Commission of Industrial Relations, a state labor review body, a judicial body, some years earlier, and negotiations had been going forward without much progress for 3.5 years before I became chief negotiator. And we had a year of very intense negotiations, and we built on what colleagues had done in previous years in molding a first contract. And through some marathon bargaining sessions, finally a breakthrough session in the spring of 1983 when I was chief negotiator, we finally wore the university regents and their negotiators down, I think, and they finally conceded that there was going to have to be a contract between the Board of Regents and the faculty. And so I was very gratified to have a role in negotiating that first contract, and I think it's been very beneficial, quite frankly, not alone for this faculty, but I think for other units in other parts of the university. We always felt that we were negotiating not alone for ourselves, but for other units of the university, because the regents, once they were brought to the bargaining table through the legal process, embraced the whole notion of collective bargaining, especially comparability, peer institution comparability. I had to laugh some years later after we got our first contract. The university was preparing to expand the architecture hall, and of all things, there's a comparability factor among peer institutions, and so they sought information, comparability information, how many restrooms ought to be in that new facility based upon comparable institutions, our comparable institutions. It's an amazing thing.
Well, you've, as our discussion, I think, has brought out so far, and we incidentally have about 5 minutes left now.
Oh,
you've played a number of roles in the history of this university. And those roles brought you into contact with many, many people. As spokesman for the faculty, you attended, as faculty senate president, you attended Board of Regents meetings. You certainly had regular meetings with the chancellor and several chancellors in the time that you were here. Five
chancellors.
Do you have any particular memories of the people that you've worked with and dealt with over the years?
Oh my goodness, there are so many, and to name some and not name others would be to slight them. I think probably, though, going against my own warning to myself, I would have to say that the years that I worked with Del Weber as chancellor, his tenure in the chancellorship kind of paralleled your deanship in the Arts College. I had an opportunity to work very closely with him and with the administrative staff, and of course to be exposed to the Board of Regents and their meetings and deliberations. And while I had some misgivings about how we might interact with one another. I have to say that it was a very collegial relationship that he and I had over the years. We got off to a rocky start when I upstaged him in my first address to the faculty at the faculty convocation upon my return to the presidency of the Faculty Senate in 1991. He always razzed me about that. And in fact, it was on the basis of my upstaging him and going on for so long. I have a reputation for talking at length. And I did at that time. I received the Chancellor's Candor Award at the Faculty Senate banquet at the end of that academic year in 1992 and received a very nice plaque kind of razzing me about my long-windedness. But I got him back. I used the name H. Carl Camp, and then the plaque was inscribed Carl H. Camp. And it placed the date of my speech to the faculty as, I don't know, September 14th, a year in advance of when it actually happened. And so I was able to razz him. We had really a very good working relationship. He always brought up my long-windedness in every public venue, and I always razzed him about his inability to get the details straight. And so it was a very rewarding experience, both working with and for the faculty, but also having occasion to work with the Chancellor and his colleagues in the administrative sector.
Well, we're about at the conclusion of this now. We have another minute or two. Could you maybe in 30 seconds or so tell us what you're doing now? You're retired? What are you doing in retirement?
I'm enjoying a new sense of freedom after having experienced for substantially 40 years of the tyranny of the class schedule and class responsibilities. I'm completely free to make my own schedule, and it's wonderful.
Well, we certainly appreciate your taking time from that schedule to be with us here this morning.
My
thank
pleasure.
you, Carl. We really do appreciate it. And I thank you today for joining us in the audience in our visit with Dr. H. Carl Camp, a longtime professor of political science at UN Omaha. We've been taking a look at some of the history of UN Omaha as seen through the eyes of the history makers. This is Jack Newton inviting you to join us again in the series we call Reflections in Time.
Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.